Hey, in this fun experiment, let's see if we can take something and turn it into something that is usable inside a game engine. So for example, I thought why not go to Sketchpad and just download something that was actually scanned. So here's a free model, and I'll give you a link in the description so you guys can follow me along as well. And so here's the scan. The scan is really cool, right? It's like a real statue of this Egyptian head, and it's ginormous, right? You can see that it has 42,000 triangles. So if you wanted to use this as a game model, that would be probably not a good idea, right? And we can go on the Sketchpad. If you click on this little model inspector, you can click on wireframe and you can see what that actually looks like, right? So what would be a process or a pipeline to take something like this or something similar and turn it into a game model, right? So you can maybe stick it in the back as like your environment piece or something like that. Well, let's try this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to download this model by clicking on this button here, and then I'm going to import this file into zBrush, and I'm just going to grab the OBJ format just to keep it nice and basic, and I'll meet you in zBrush. Alright, so here I am in zBrush. I'm currently using the latest version, but the way I'm going to do this will work pretty much in any last 5-6 years of zBrush versions. We're not going to do anything that is new, right? So the first thing I would like to do to bring the model into zBrush is I personally just like to go to Lightbox and I activate my Dynamax sphere just so I get all my controllers and everything. And so the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import the OBJ file by clicking in the tools settings here. I'm going to say import. And here it is. So I'm going to grab my scoped.obj and say open. So when you download yours, you will see as well that it comes in kind of a sideways, which is fine, right? So the first thing I would like to do is I'm going to jump out of my perspective mode, hold down the shift key, snap it into kind of in the orthographic straight view, then go to my move tool and let's just straighten this up. So I'm going to straighten this up something like this, and I'm watching the base, right? And then I'm going to turn it this way so it's a little more presentable. If you wanted to center your pivot, you can unlock it and then do a reset. And I believe you can even click on this and do a reset and then lock it back up, and this way your pivot is going to be centered, right? You can see that. Let's go ahead and turn the perspective mode back on and just take a look. So this is a really cool scan. But again, if I turn on my draw polyframe, right, you can see that it's really dense. So it's not really usable as a game object. All right, so let's have some fun. So the first thing to do is definitely going to be, we don't want to lose some of those gorgeous textures that the model has. So let's bring those in. So I'm going to go to texture. I'm going to say import texture. And I'm just going to grab this 0.jpg that comes with the model. I'm going to say open. All right, and then the next thing I need to do is actually apply the texture that I just imported into this, into this mesh, right? So to do this, I'm going to go to texture map, and I can say new texture. Then I can click on the new texture, the blank one that was created, and then of course I can click on the texture that was imported. Now, when I click on it, you can see that it doesn't look right. And the reason for that is in ZBrush, you do have to flip. So I'm going to go to texture. I'm going to select my texture that I imported, and then you have to click on this button right here called flip vertical. So as soon as I do, watch what happens to this texture. You can see that the head just moved, it flipped upside down, right? Which means if I go back to my texture map here and select it one more time, it should fix itself. So there you have it. So now you have the OBJ file from Sketchfab with the texture applied, right? All right, so how do we turn this, once again, into a low poly model, right? Well, the first step of doing something like that is you definitely want to convert this texture to Polypaint. So that's going to be the very first step. So to do this, this model, even though it's dense, it has 21,000 points. It's still not enough to hold the Polypaint information from this texture. So I'm going to subdivide it a bunch of times. If I go to my geometry tab, I can divide this, or I can press Ctrl D, and then you can see how a new subdivision was added, and my active points are going up. So right now I went from 20 something to 128. I'm going to do it again and again. So I'm at 2 million. This is really, really dense, right? If I turn my polyframe on, you can see there's 2 million points. And this is going to be enough for us to turn this texture into Polypaint. All right, so to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Polypaint, and I'm going to click on the button called Polypaint from Texture. All right, so as soon as I click on it, it looks like nothing happened, but our texture, if I turn my texture off, so let's turn it off here, we don't need it, and let's even go here, texture map, and let's go ahead and just turn this deselected, right? So we're not even using it. So you can see there's no texture being used, but the color information is still there, and that's because we turned our texture into a Polypaint. So it's literally being painted onto the model. If you have any touch-ups, right, you can even grab something like the brush, maybe turn the RGB on because I don't want to sculpt, right? And let's hover over like this area here, for example. I can press C to sample this color, right? You can see this color was sampled. And now I can literally paint and fix any issues that I have. I can even turn down my RGB intensity and maybe do it a little more subtle, in a subtle way. So you can go around and fix whatever you feel needs to be fixed in whatever you're doing. So, all right, very cool. Once you've done that, the next step would be to turn this into a low poly mesh. All right, so the second step is going to be, what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to turn off, let's go ahead and name these. I'm going to rename this to high, right? That's going to be my original. I'm going to go to the second one, I'm going to rename it to low, and this is going to be my low poly game model. All right, so I'm going to turn off my high one. I don't want to see it at this moment. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my geometry. I'm going to dial this back down, and I'm going to delete higher, right? So I am now only viewing the original 21,000 verts or active points of whatever the file was before we subdivided it, right? And I can even turn off the Polypaint. Honestly, I don't need it at this point. All right, the only thing I'm concerned about in the very first step of creating this low poly version is if I turn on my polyframe, I really need this topology to be much, much, much lighter. So for something like this, the best way to do this is, I'm also going to jump out of my active symmetry. I don't want that on. But the best way to do this is definitely going to Z plugins, and then going to, let's go to Decimation Master, and let's go ahead and do a pre-process current. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to decimate the current and then watch the topology of my model, right? So right now it's 21,000 points. You can see what it looks like. If I decimate it at 20%, this is what I get. It went down to 4,000. Let's just do something more dramatic. How about we go to 4%. I'm going to decimate it again. And now I have something very low, 858 points. Now I'm looking at it, and this pretty much would be a perfect background asset, like a low poly game model, right? All right, very nice. So that was pretty easy. Now the next challenge is going to be transferring that Polypaint over from the high one to the low one. How do we do that? Well, the first thing you want to do as your step 3, you want to create UVs for the low poly version that you just created. So to do that, I'm going to go to, again, Z plugins. I'm going to go to UV master. I'm going to turn off my symmetry, and I'm going to click on wrap. If you want to see what your UVs look like, you can click on flatten, You can see what that looks like. You can even press W and move it around if you wanted to. You know, you can rotate it, whatever you want to do with it. I'm just going to leave mine alone. And let's say I'm happy with this, right? So I'm going to go unflatten. And now I know that I have a low poly version, and I know that my UVs are done. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to project my Polypaint over to this low poly version from the high to low, right? So to do this, same concept applies. We need to make sure that we have enough topology or enough active points to hold the poly paint information. So again, just like before, I'm going to go to my divide under geometry, and I'm just going to divide it a bunch of times. And I'm going to get it all the way up to 1.3 million. I think that's going to be enough. Okay. I'm going to go back to Subtool, and now what I would like to do is I'm going to project this one on top over to the one on the bottom. So I'm going to have both of these visible. I'm going to make sure that my low one is selected, and then I'm going to go to project, right? And let's go ahead and adjust the distance. Maybe you can play around and see what works for you. So I'm going to set it to maybe 0.7, and I'm going to turn this up a little bit as well. The mean, I'm going to put it to 70. Again, you can just play around and see what makes sense. And then I'm going to simply click project, and you can see that my geometry and color are both on. So I'm going to say project. ZBrush is going to ask me, would you like to project the poly painting to the active subtool? I'm going to say yes. Okay. Once that's done, you can see what that looks like. If you have any issues that where the geometry is popping, or you see some kind of a weird misalignment, again, play around with these settings, maybe undo, and try different settings and see if you could get a better result. I'm very happy with my result. So what I can do now is I'm going to hide the top version. I'm going to turn off my poly frame, and now I can see that my low poly version has all of this beautiful poly paint projected from the high one. Very cool, right? So now what I need to do is I'm going to go down to my texture map, and I'm going to say create, and I'm going to say create a texture, new texture from my Polypaint information. So as soon as I click on it, you can see a new texture was created, and if you hover over it, you can see what that looks like. It doesn't look too great, but it does work. You can see that it's actually being applied. If you turn this on and off and look really carefully, you can see that it's actually being applied onto your mesh, right? So I'm going to leave that on. I'm going to go to my geometry, and now I'm going to dial this way back down to the original version, which was 858 points, right? So if you turn your polyframe on, you can see that this is indeed a low poly mesh with beautiful texture and UVs ready to go. So this is how easy it is to turn something like a scan, or in this case a statue, into a low poly model. So I hope you found this useful. At this point, all you need to do is literally just delete the higher, because you just want the low one, right? And just export your mesh and export your texture. If you export this texture and you want to bring this into something like Substance Painter, you will have to flip your vertical orientation again to make sure that Substance Painter will see it properly. And I believe, honestly, you have to flip it for any application, Maya or game engine. You do need to flip this over when you export this texture, right? All right, so thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next video.